On a winter morning in the village of Manteno, Illinois, a folded square of paper dropped from a second-story window and landed in the frozen yard below. The window it fell from had been nailed shut from the inside. The woman who wrote the letter could not open that window, could not leave the room, and could not receive a visitor without her husband's permission. She had been placed there by the man she married, a respected minister, and she had already spent 3 years locked away once before. The paper in the snow was the only part of her that was still free to move. What it said, and what happened when a neighbor picked it up, would end with 12 men deciding her fate in the time it takes to boil an egg. The record that survives is not a rumor and not a legend. It sits in a county courthouse in Illinois, in the books she later wrote, and in the laws that still carry her name. Manteno was a small prairie town in Kankakee County, 40 miles or so south of Chicago, in the years just before the Civil War. It was farmland, mostly. Clapboard houses, a rail line, a scattering of churches, and the wide, flat Illinois sky that gave a person nowhere to hide from a neighbor's attention. Into a place like that, a Calvinist meeting house was not a building on a corner. It was the center of the week, the seat of local judgment, and the household of its minister was watched the way people watch anything they believe belongs to them. To understand what happened to the woman inside that household, it helps to understand what a wife legally was in America in 1860. Under the old common law doctrine of coverture, a married woman had almost no separate legal existence. Her property became her husband's, her earnings became his, her children were his to place and direct. She could not easily sue, sign a contract, or hold what was hers against his wishes. In the eyes of the law, she was, in large part, absorbed into the person of her husband, and her protection depended almost entirely on his goodwill. When that goodwill failed, there was very little standing between a wife and whatever her husband decided to do with her. 19th century America had a quiet history of what was done in those cases. Women who were merely inconvenient, who argued, who read, who embarrassed, who stood in the way of a remarriage or a household's peace, could be declared unwell and shut away, sometimes in asylums, and sometimes in the back rooms and attics of respectable houses, with the neighbors told a simple story, and the neighbors, more often than not, accepting it. The records that survive are only the cases that broke into the open. The Packard case broke into the open. Many never did. The minister in Manteno was Theophilus Packard, a serious and hard-edged clergyman in the old New England Calvinist tradition. He preached the doctrines he had inherited, chief among them the total depravity of the human soul, the belief that every person is born corrupt and helpless before God. He did not consider these matters open to debate. He had trained in them, he had built his life on them, and he expected his congregation and his home to hold to them without argument. By the late 1850s, the Packards had moved through several states and settled in Manteno with their children. On the surface, it was the picture the town wanted to see: a minister, his wife, and a full house. The wife was Elizabeth Parsons Ware Packard. She had been born in Ware, Massachusetts, in 1816, the daughter of a congregational minister named Samuel Ware. She had grown up in a home that valued learning, and had been given an education unusual for a girl of her time, studying at a female seminary and reading widely. She had taught school briefly before she married. She was, by every account that survives, intelligent, articulate, and difficult to talk over. In her early 20s, at her parents' urging, she married Theophilus Packard, a man roughly 14 years older than she was. She would remain married to him for the rest of her life, though not, in the end, in the same house. There was, in the shape of her early life, a quiet warning of the collision to come. Elizabeth had been raised inside the same Calvinist world her husband would later rule, the daughter of a minister, surrounded from childhood by sermons and doctrine and the expectation of obedience. But she had also been given books and a mind trained to use them, and the two gifts did not sit easily together in a woman of her time. She had studied at a female seminary, in an era when serious education for girls was rare and, in some quarters, suspected. She had taught. She had opinions she could defend. When she married Theophilus at her parents' urging, she married a man who wanted a wife of exactly her competence and none of her independence, a partner who would run a household flawlessly and never contradict him. For a long time she gave him the first without withholding the second too openly. The marriage held because she kept the harder half of herself out of his sight. It began to fail the moment she stopped. For 20 years, Elizabeth was what the town expected a minister's wife to be. She kept the household, grew the family's vegetables, sewed the children's clothes, and bore 6 children over those 2 decades. Their names are in the record: Theophilus the younger, Isaac, Samuel, Elizabeth, George, and the youngest, still a small child in 1860. To the congregation she was a competent and devoted mother, and to her husband she was, for a long time, a manageable partner in a household he governed. The trouble, when it came, did not come from anything she did with her hands. It came from what she did with her mind. For most of 2 decades that arrangement held. The household in the years before Mantegno had moved with the ministry, through more than one state, and in each place Elizabeth did the work that made a minister's home run, and raised the children who filled it. She was not idle in her mind through those years. She read. She followed the religious arguments moving through the country, the revivals and the new theologies and the fierce debates about the nature of God and the soul. And somewhere in the reading and the thinking, and the long, ordinary labor of the household, she stopped being able to believe the thing her husband preached from the pulpit every week. The change in her was not sudden, and it was not loud. It was the slow arrival of a woman at her own conclusions, which is the most ordinary thing in the world, and, in her particular world, one of the most dangerous. Elizabeth had begun to read, and to think her way out of the theology she had been raised in. She could not accept the idea that a newborn child was a depraved and hopeless thing. She was drawn instead toward gentler ideas that were moving through American religious life in those years, currents that would later be gathered under names like Universalism and Swedenborgianism, the belief that the soul was not born condemned, and that a loving God did not require the doctrines her husband preached. She did not keep these thoughts entirely to herself. In a place where the minister's household was a public thing, that was enough to begin the unraveling. The break came inside Theophilus's own church. Elizabeth took part in a Bible class connected to the congregation, and in it she began to voice her own views, plainly and without apology. She questioned total depravity in front of other members. She spoke as a person who had read and thought and reached her own conclusions, which was precisely the problem. A minister's wife was not supposed to have a separate theology, and she was certainly not supposed to teach it to his flock. Word traveled fast in a small prairie town. Some members were fascinated, others were scandalized. Theophilus was humiliated in the one arena where his authority was supposed to be absolute. The specific doctrine at the center of it deserves a plain hearing, because the whole disaster grew from it. Total depravity, in the Calvinism Theophilus preached, meant that human beings are born wholly corrupted by sin, unable to choose good on their own, and deserving of condemnation from the first breath. It was not a fringe belief, it was the spine of his theology and the theology of his church. What Elizabeth had come to instead was gentler, and, to him, intolerable. She believed the soul was not born damned, that a loving God did not consign infants to depravity, that a person might reason and hope her way toward the divine. In another household, these might have stayed a private matter between husband and wife. In this one, they were heresy, spoken inside the minister's own congregation by the minister's own wife, and they called his authority into question in front of the people he led. A man could forgive a great deal more easily than he could forgive that. Theophilus did not forgive it. He began, instead, to describe it as sickness. There was more than doctrine at stake in the household. These were the years of the deepening national crisis over slavery, and by some accounts the Packards did not stand on the same ground there either. Elizabeth's sympathies ran toward the abolitionist cause, including sympathy for the men who had raised arms at Harper's Ferry, while her husband's leanings ran the other way. Whatever the exact shape of it, the marriage had become a place where a strong-willed, educated woman kept arriving at conclusions her husband found intolerable, and where he had begun to search for a way to make the arriving stop. He found one in the law. And here the story stops being only a family quarrel and becomes something colder, because what Theophilus reached for was not unusual and not illegal. It was a statute on the books of the state of Illinois. In 1851, the Illinois legislature had passed a law governing who could be committed to the state's asylum for the insane. For most people, commitment required some form of hearing, some evidence weighed before a person could be shut away. But the law carved out an exception. A married woman could be committed to the state asylum at the request of her husband, without the evidence of insanity that the law required in other cases. In plain terms, a husband's word was enough. He did not have to prove that his wife was mad. He had only to want her gone, and to find a superintendent willing to receive her. The asylum that would receive her was itself a product of good intentions gone strange. The great state hospitals of the mid-19th century had been built by reformers who believed that the insane, long chained in jails and poorhouses, could be healed in calm, orderly institutions under humane medical care. That was the promise. The reality, within a few decades, was crowded wards, thin diagnoses, and a rising population of patients who arrived easily and left rarely. The catalog of reasons a person could be admitted to such places, preserved in the era's own hospital records, reads now like a list of ordinary human troubles and inconvenient traits rather than diseases. Grief could be a reason. Religious excitement could be a reason. A woman's disobedience could be a reason. And because the law in Illinois let a husband commit a wife without the proof required for anyone else, the door that was meant to admit the sick stood open to admit the merely unwanted. Elizabeth Packard would walk through it not because a doctor had found a disease, but because a husband had found a use for one. Theophilus set about building the appearance of a case. He gathered observations of his wife's behavior, the ordinary behavior of a woman who read too much and believed the wrong things, and he framed them as symptoms. He consulted at least one physician. He arranged, quietly, for her admission. And he told himself, and later a courtroom, that he was acting to protect his 6 children and his church from what he considered her dangerous ideas. In his account, he was not a jailer. He was a husband, exercising a legal right and a Christian duty. The law agreed with him. On the morning of June 18, 1860, they came for her. Elizabeth was in her home, in her nightclothes, when men arrived to take her to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane at Jacksonville. She was carried out of her own house and away from her children, over her protest, without a trial, without a hearing, without a jury, and without any finding by any court that there was anything wrong with her mind at all. There was nothing she could do. Under the statute that carried her away, a sane woman and an insane one had exactly the same standing, which is to say, none. The manner of it mattered as much as the fact. She was not summoned, not examined in any court, not given a chance to answer. Men came to the house in the early part of the day and took her while she was still in her nightclothes, and the surviving account has her carried out over her protest as her own children watched their mother removed from her home. Whatever composure she was known for, this was the kind of mourning that would break most people, and the horror of it was precisely that nothing about it was against the law. The state had built a road that ran straight from a husband's displeasure to a locked ward, and on that June morning, Elizabeth Packard was driven down it. Jacksonville was a large institution, one of the era's new state asylums built with reformist hopes and filled, as such places often were, with people whose troubles ranged from real illness to simple inconvenience. Its superintendent was Dr. Andrew McFarland, a figure of considerable authority in the young American profession of asylum medicine. Into his care, Elizabeth Packard was delivered, and there she would remain for 3 years. The institution at Jacksonville was, on paper, one of the better ones, and Dr. McFarland was no crude villain, but a respected man of his profession. That is part of what makes the case so cold. Elizabeth was not thrown into a dungeon. She was received into a modern hospital by a distinguished doctor, entered into the records and cared for according to the standards of the day. And none of that changed the central fact that a sane woman had been shut away from her life and her children, on no finding of illness at all. The competence of the place did not rescue her. It only made her confinement look respectable, which is a more dangerous thing than cruelty, because respectable confinement is the kind no one thinks to question. She did not accept it. This is the detail that separates her from so many women swallowed by the same system and never heard from again. Elizabeth Packard refused, from the first day to the last, to concede that she was insane. She kept her reason as a kind of discipline. She observed the place carefully. She watched other women who had been committed on grounds as thin as her own, some of them simply old, or poor, or unwanted, or in the way of a husband's second choice. She wrote when she could. She argued her sanity to anyone who would listen, including the superintendent, and her refusal to break became, in the strange logic of the institution, further proof that she was ill. A patient who insists she is sane is only demonstrating how sick she is. It is a trap with no floor. So she made a study of the trap instead. Across those 3 years, she watched the women around her with a clear and careful eye, and what she saw hardened into the material of everything she would later write. She saw women who were old or poor or grieving or simply in someone's way, filed into the wards on grounds no sturdier than her own. She saw how easily a sane person could be kept once the papers said otherwise, and how completely the outside world was willing to forget a woman it had been told to forget. She kept her own counsel, kept her reason, and, when she could get hold of paper, kept notes. She was building a case inside a place designed to make certain that no one within it ever had one. 3 years is a long time to hold a mind together against an institution telling it daily that it is broken. She held. 3 years passed inside those walls. Her children grew without her. Her husband kept the house and the pulpit and the family standing, and the town of Manteno, for the most part, went on as if the minister's wife had simply gone somewhere to be cared for, which was the version they had been given, and the version it was easiest to believe. That easy belief is its own part of the story. It costs a community nothing to accept that a difficult woman has been sensibly cared for, and it costs a great deal to ask harder questions of a respected man. Manteno, by and large, chose the version that let it sleep. Her children were told what children are told. Her place at the table, in the pew, in the town's picture of itself, quietly closed over, the way water closes over a dropped stone. Had nothing further happened, that might well have been the end of Elizabeth Packard, remembered, if at all, as the minister's poor mad wife. Something further happened. What finally moved was not the law and not the doctors. It was her oldest son. By 1863, the eldest Packard child, Theophilus the younger, had reached an age where his voice carried some weight, and he pressed for his mother's release. The hospital's trustees reviewed her case. They could not, after 3 years, point to a cure, because there had never been an illness. So they discharged her in the summer of 1863 with a document that let everyone save face. They released her, but they released her labeled incurable. Incurably insane, she walked out of Jacksonville a free woman on paper and a mad woman on the record, and she went home to Manteno, to her husband and her younger children, because she had nowhere else in the world to go. There was a bitter logic in that label. To have released her as cured would have been to admit she had been treatable, and to have released her as sane would have been to admit she had never belonged there at all. Incurable was the word that protected everyone but her. It let the institution close her file without confessing a mistake, and it handed her husband a document that declared, in the language of medicine, that his wife was permanently and hopelessly out of her mind. She went home carrying a paper that was worth more against her than any accusation he could have invented on his own, because this one wore the authority of a state hospital. The 3 years had not only taken her time, they had armed the man she was returning to. Home was not freedom. Home was the second confinement, and in some ways it was the worse of the two. Theophilus had no intention of letting his wife move freely through the house and the town, spreading her ideas and her account of what had been done to her. He had a discharge paper that called her incurably insane, and he meant to use it. He put locks on things. She could not get food or clean linen or the ordinary supplies of a household without his permission. And then, as the weather turned toward winter, he took the final step. He confined her to a room in their own home, the nursery, and he nailed the windows shut from the inside so that she could not open them and no one could see her through them. He forbade visitors. He kept the room without a fire while the Illinois winter came down around the house. For something close to 6 weeks by the surviving accounts, Elizabeth Packard lived in a cold, sealed room in her own home, a prisoner of the man the town called Reverend, while he made arrangements to send her away again. There were plans, she understood, to commit her a second time, perhaps to move her east to Massachusetts, where the laws gave a husband even more power over a wife than Illinois did. The weeks in that room were their own kind of punishment, quieter than the asylum and in some ways more intimate in their cruelty. It was winter in northern Illinois, and the room had no fire. She could not open the windows he had nailed. She could not summon food or clean linen except by his leave. She could not show her face to a passing neighbor or receive a friend at the door. The house went on around her own house, with her children somewhere inside it, and she was sealed in one of its rooms like a thing being stored until it could be disposed of, and disposal was the plan. She understood that arrangements were being made to send her away again, out of Illinois, and into a state whose laws would put her even further out of reach. Time was short, and she knew it. Whatever she was going to do, she would have to do from inside that room, through the one window she was not able to open. Here the law that had trapped her twice left a single narrow gap. It had been perfectly legal for Theophilus to commit her to the state asylum on nothing but his word. But the law did not clearly permit a husband to lock his wife away as a prisoner inside her own house, to simply put her in a room and keep her there. That distinction, thin as it was the only opening she had, and to use it, she had to get a message past the nailed windows and the locked doors and out into the world. She wrote a letter. In it, she set down her situation, plainly, the way she set down everything. And she got it to the one window and let it fall, trusting the town she had every reason not to trust, to do the right thing with it. The letter reached a friend and neighbor, a woman named Sarah Hazlitt, and Sarah Hazlitt did not look away. This is the turn in the story, and it turns on one woman's refusal to mind her own business. Sarah Hazlitt took the letter and carried its contents to a judge, Charles Starr of the local court. She did not accept the town's comfortable story that the minister's wife was simply unwell and being cared for at home. She asked the law to look, and Judge Starr agreed to look. He issued a writ of habeas corpus, the old and powerful legal instrument that requires anyone holding a person to produce that person before the court and justify the detention. The writ ordered Theophilus Packard to bring his wife out of the sealed room and into the judge's chambers on January 12, 1864, and to explain by what right he held her. The timing was a narrow kind of miracle. A few more weeks, and Elizabeth Packard might well have been on a road east, absorbed into another state's asylum system under laws even less inclined to hear her. Instead, an ancient protection, meant to stand between the individual and unlawful imprisonment, reached into a nailed-shut room in a minister's house and pulled its occupant into the light of a courtroom. For the first time in nearly 4 years, a court was going to require someone to justify the confinement of Elizabeth Packard, and for the first time in nearly 4 years, she was going to be allowed to answer. The law that had failed her at every turn was about to hand her the one thing it had always denied her, which was a hearing. Theophilus brought her. He came with the discharge paper from Jacksonville, the document that called her incurably insane, and he presented it as his authority. He told the judge that he was holding his wife lawfully, and, in his own careful phrasing, that he was allowing her all the liberty compatible with her welfare and safety. A woman in a fireless room behind nailed windows, in his telling, was being given all the freedom that was safe for her to have. Judge Starr was not satisfied that a discharge paper and a husband's assurance were enough to keep a citizen locked in a room. He did the thing the 1851 statute had denied Elizabeth Packard for 4 years. He ordered a trial, a real one, before a jury in the Kankakee County Courthouse to determine one question and one question only. Was Elizabeth Packard insane, or was she not? The trial opened on January 13, 1864, and ran for 5 days. It has come down in the record as Packard v. Packard. Husband against wife, and the whole apparatus of the era's certainties was arranged on one side of the room. Theophilus's case rested on the claim that his wife's mind was diseased, and his witnesses set out to prove it out of the material of her ordinary life. Physicians testified. One of them, a Dr. J.W. Brown, had come to the Packard home sometime earlier and interviewed Elizabeth at length while pretending to be something he was not. By her account, he introduced himself as a sewing machine salesman and drew her into conversation, and she spoke to him freely, as a woman speaks to a tradesman at her door. On the stand, he presented that conversation as a medical examination and offered her opinions as symptoms. Her religious views were entered as evidence of madness. Her belief that she had the right to hold those views was entered as evidence of madness. And an older thread was pulled forward as well. As a young woman of about 19, Elizabeth had once suffered a fever with delirium, an episode the medicine of the day called brain fever, and it was argued that insanity ran in her blood, that her mother had been troubled, and that the disease was therefore hereditary and hopeless. Everything she was, in that courtroom, could be turned into proof of what her husband needed her to be. The trial drew the town it concerned, a minister accusing his wife of madness, a wife insisting on her reason, and the open question of whether an ordinary woman's beliefs could cost her her liberty. All of it heard in open court over 5 winter days in Kankakee. The proceedings had the shape of a contest between 2 versions of the same woman. In the first version, assembled by the physicians and by her husband, every human quality she possessed became a symptom. Her intelligence was excitability. Her religious conviction was delusion. Her refusal to submit was the surest sign of a diseased mind, because a healthy woman, in that reasoning, would simply have submitted. In the second version, offered by the people who lived near her and watched her keep a house and raise children, she was a capable woman who had been wronged and nothing more. The jury would have to choose which woman was real, and everything hung on the choice, her freedom, her name, and her future. All of it resting on 12 men in a county courtroom weighing a wife's word against a minister's. Against all of that stood the plain testimony of people who had actually watched her live. Her neighbors took the stand. A couple named Blessing, Methodists who had known the Packards, testified to her sanity in ordinary terms. Sarah Hazlitt, the neighbor who had carried the letter, described what she had seen with her own eyes. She told the court about calling on Elizabeth after her return from Jacksonville and finding her out in the yard cleaning the feather beds, putting a neglected house back in order, doing exactly the work a competent mistress of a household does. She described the sealed room and the window fastened shut with nails and screws from the inside. The picture the neighbors drew was not of a madwoman. It was of a capable, reasonable woman who had been treated as a madwoman because it was convenient for a powerful man that she should be one. It was a striking thing, in that time and place, to see ordinary neighbors step forward against the word of their minister. Deference to the pulpit ran strong, and the safe course was silence. Yet the people who had actually seen Elizabeth Packard live her days would not put their names to the story that she was mad. Their testimony was not learned or grand. It was the plain evidence of the eyes. A woman cleaning feather beds in her yard, a window sealed with nails and screws, a house that looked, when its mistress was allowed to keep it, exactly like a sane woman's house. Against the machinery of expert opinion, that plainness turned out to be the more powerful thing. Elizabeth herself was present through it all, composed and watchful. The same discipline she had held for 3 years in Jacksonville, now holding in a courtroom where her freedom was the verdict. She did not rave, she did not break. She sat as the living contradiction of everything her husband's witnesses claimed she was. On January 18, 1864, the case went to the jury. 12 men withdrew to decide whether the minister's wife was sane. They were back in 7 minutes. Their verdict was that Elizabeth Packard was sane, and had been all along. The court ordered that she be freed from all restraint. After 4 years, 3 of them behind asylum walls, and the last of them behind nailed windows in her own home, a jury needed less than the length of a hymn to see what the entire system had refused to see. It should have been the moment of triumph, and in the courtroom it was. But the law that had failed her was not finished with her yet, and her husband had already made sure that winning would cost her nearly everything she had left. On the night before the verdict came down, while the outcome still hung in the air, Theophilus Packard acted. He sold the family home. He gathered the younger children, her money, the household furniture, her clothing, and even the notes and papers she had been keeping, and he left Illinois for Massachusetts. By the time she was declared sane and free, there was no home to return to, no children in the house, and no property in her name. And once again, none of it was a crime. Under the laws of Illinois and of Massachusetts, a husband could do all of it. A married woman had no separate right to her home, her earnings, or, in the deepest wound of all, her own children. Elizabeth Packard walked out of the Kankakee courthouse, a free and sane woman, and she walked out with nothing. The cruelty of it was written into the law itself. Everything Theophilus had taken, the house, the money, the furniture, the children, he had taken lawfully, because under the rules of marriage in that era, there was almost nothing in the household that was hers to lose in the first place. A verdict of sanity restored her liberty, and not one thing besides. She could go where she liked. She simply had nowhere to go, nothing to go with, and no legal claim on the family that had just been carried out of the state ahead of her. The system had one more lesson to teach her before she was done with it, and she learned it standing free and empty-handed, while the man who had confined her kept everything they had built. A great many people, freed at 47 with no money, no home, and no children, would have disappeared into the quiet ruin the system had prepared for them. Elizabeth Packard did the opposite. She took the exact machinery that had been used against her and set out to break it, in public, with her name on the work. She wrote. She had spent years watching and remembering, and now she put it all down. She published a series of books that told her story and argued her case, works with titles like Marital Power Exemplified in Mrs. Packard's Trial, which appeared in 1866, and The Prisoner's Hidden Life, and the 2-volume Modern Persecution, or Insane Asylums Unveiled. In them, she laid out not only what had happened to her, but what she had seen happen to other women, the ones still inside, committed on a husband's whim and forgotten. In one of the books, she set down the thing that had been at the root of it all, that she had believed religious tolerance to be the vital principle her country was built on, and had supposed, in her ignorance, that this right belonged to every American citizen, even to the wife of a clergyman. The books sold. And with the money they earned, she did 2 things at once. She supported herself, and she funded a campaign. The books were not quiet memoirs. They were indictments. In them, Elizabeth Packard named what had been done to her and set it beside what she had seen done to others, laying the whole mechanism open on the page. She wrote about the law that had made a wife's sanity a matter of her husband's convenience. She wrote about the wards and the women kept in them past all reason. She wrote about the doctors who mistook obedience for health, and about a society that found it easier to believe a woman mad than to believe a respected man cruel. Readers bought the books in numbers, drawn by the scandal and kept by the argument, and every copy sold was both a dollar toward her independence and one more person who now knew what the statutes allowed. She had been silenced once, carried off in her nightclothes with no chance to speak. She made certain she would never be silent again. She went to the legislatures. She traveled from state house to state house, a middle-aged woman with a discharge paper that had once called her incurably insane, and she stood before lawmakers and demanded that they change the law. Her central target was the very statute that had carried her out of her home in her nightclothes. In 1867, the Illinois legislature responded to her lobbying by passing what became known as the Personal Liberty Bill, a law that required real evidence, a jury trial, and the right to be heard before any person could be committed to an asylum. Crucially, it extended that protection to married women, establishing in law that a husband's authority over his wife was not without limit and could not override basic due process. The exception that had made her disposable was closed. None of it came easily. She was one woman, past the middle of her life, carrying a discharge paper that any opponent could wave as proof she was mad, walking into rooms full of men who made the laws. She wrote letters, gathered signatures, published, spoke, and returned again and again to the same state houses until they moved. And as she gained ground, she gained enemies, chief among them the rising profession of asylum medicine, which did not care to have its judgments overturned by a former patient it had labeled incurable. The doctors had expertise, standing, and the presumption of science on their side. Elizabeth Packard had her story, her books, and a refusal to go quiet that had already survived 3 years of every pressure an institution could bring to break it. Against that, the experts found her surprisingly hard to defeat. She did not stop at Illinois. She carried the fight into other states, meeting legislators, organizing support, and pressing her case wherever the old laws still stood. In Iowa, a reform that came to be called Packard's Law made it illegal for asylum officials to intercept and withhold the mail of their patients, so that a person shut away could no longer be silenced simply by cutting off every letter to the outside world. By the reckoning of the institutions that later studied her, her efforts helped reshape commitment laws in 4 states, and Illinois passed a married women's property law that began to recognize a wife's separate right to what was hers. Laws that protected people from exactly what had been done to Elizabeth Packard were written, in part, because Elizabeth Packard would not let the matter rest. The Iowa mail law deserves a moment on its own because of what it quietly admits. To forbid an asylum from intercepting its patients' letters is to concede that asylums had been doing exactly that, cutting off the confined from the one thread that might have pulled them out. Elizabeth Packard understood the value of a letter better than any legislator in the room. A single sheet of paper dropped from a nailed window had been the whole difference, in her own case, between a courtroom and a slow disappearance. She wrote that knowledge into the statute books of another state, so that the next woman sealed in a room would have a better chance than she had of reaching the world outside it. Her private life never fully healed, and this is where the honest record grows quiet and, in places, disagrees with itself. With the earnings from her books, she bought a house in Chicago near the end of the 1860s and rebuilt a life of her own. As new laws recognizing married women's rights to property and custody took hold around 1869, she pressed for the return of her younger children. Here the accounts do not entirely agree, and it would be a disservice to pretend they do. Some records hold that by the end of the decade, the courts recognized her right to her 3 youngest children, and that they were restored to her. Others hold that Theophilus, having taken them to Massachusetts, kept them largely beyond her reach, and that she never fully regained the youngest of them. What is not in dispute is that years of their childhood were taken and could not be given back, and that whatever reunion came, it came late, and at a cost no verdict could repay. She and Theophilus never divorced. Both of them opposed divorce, for their own reasons, and they lived apart for the rest of their lives, married on paper to the end. It is worth sitting with the arithmetic of her victory, because it was not a clean one. She had gone into the asylum a wife and mother of 6, with a home and a place in her town. She came out the far end of the whole ordeal, years later, with her freedom, her name cleared, her books written, and laws changed across several states because of her, and also with a family broken in ways no statute could mend, and a marriage that would never be a marriage again. She had saved women she would never meet from the thing that had been done to her, and she had not been able to undo what was done to her own children's early years. Both of those things are true at once, and she carried them both for the rest of her life. Elizabeth Packard kept working into her later years, undaunted by the growing and increasingly organized opposition of the psychiatric profession, which did not welcome a laywoman rewriting the rules of commitment. She spent time in California in her old age, living near one of her sons. She had once written a line that stands as well as any as the summary of the second half of her life, that the more freedom she had, the more she wanted. And she wrote, of the women she had left behind in the asylums, that knowing their helpless and hopeless condition, she could find no rest for her liberated soul, so long as her associates were not delivered also. She died in Chicago on July 25, 1897, at the age of 80. The village of Manteno is still there in Kankakee County. The great state hospital at Jacksonville, where she spent 3 years, passed into history like most of the institutions of its kind. The courthouse where 12 men freed her in 7 minutes still stands in the county that heard the case. And the law that carried her out of her home on a June morning in 1860, the law that made a sane woman disposable on a husband's word, is gone, undone in part by the woman it was used against. She had been labeled incurable. She proved, instead, to be the cure for the thing that labeled her. What she left behind is not a monument in a town square, but something more durable and harder to see. It is in the requirement, now largely taken for granted, that a person cannot be committed on another person's mere say-so, that there must be evidence and a hearing and the right to answer. It is in the slow legal recognition that a wife is a person in her own right and not a possession folded into her husband. These protections did not begin and end with her, and she would not have claimed they did, but a real share of them was pried loose from the old order by a woman who had felt, in her own body and her own years, exactly what their absence cost. The law had called her incurable. She spent the rest of her life curing the law. The historical record does not tell everything. It does not tell what passed between husband and wife in the years the disagreement was hardening into something worse, and it does not fully settle what became of every child. But the parts that are documented well. They sit in the court record of Packard v. Packard, in the books Elizabeth Packard wrote and published in her own name, in the collections of the state that held her, and in the statutes that changed because of her. This was not a woman who vanished. This was a woman who was written down by her own hand so that she could not be erased.